Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching my podcast. I am Arup K. Chatterjee, and I'm joined from Malta by a very special guest, and that is Professor Godfrey Baldacchino. Now, before I tell you how I know Professor Baldacchino and what we are going to talk about today, Professor Baldacchino is professor of sociology at the University of Malta, and just today, I was, just trying to brush up my memory about the record that this overwhelming record that Professor enjoys, and apart from many other things, Professor Baldacchino between 2016 and 2020 was the UNESCO co-chair in Island Studies and Sustainability at the University of Prince Edward Island. Professor Baldacchino was also the founder of what is now a renowned journal called Island Studies, in which I've also had the privilege of publishing. Professor Baldacchino has been very kind to write a wonderful blurb, a critical review for my book, Adam's Bridge, about which we may spend a minute or two today. I don't know if time permits. And what is very interesting, very intriguing in Professor Baldacchino's history is that in 1984, which is 40 years from today, back in time, he was elected as the first president of the Malta Astronomical Society, and he was inscribed as an honorary member of the Malta Astronomical Society in 2015. Just before we started recording, as I mentioned this fact to Professor Baldacchino, he seemed to, very nonchalantly brush it aside and said that it was just part of his hobby. So if astronomy could be somebody's hobby, Professor, I wonder what suggestions you would have for me. Professor, welcome to my podcast. Thank you so much for joining. How have you been?
Arup, thank you so much for hosting me. It's a great pleasure to be on your podcast, and I couldn't help smile at your introduction. Very few people know that I do have a past life as an amateur astronomer, particularly focused on meteor astronomy. So meteors are shooting stars. It's one of those aspects of astronomy that remains highly democratized because it's not taken up by sophisticated instrumentation. And all you need is a dark sky setting. You relax, you look up, and you enjoy the wonders of the universe, while, if you wish, taking some notes. How frequently do you see these meteors? What is their brightness? Where are they radiating from? And on the basis of that knowledge, you accumulate enough information that can then feed into a global database, which allows us to extrapolate orbits, debris in the solar system, all that fine, fantastic stuff that is at the heart of science. So I was really privileged having a fantastic team of friends, mainly, with me, to first having set up the Students' Astronomical Circle back in 1978. And then we merged with another organization, the Malta Astronomical Association, to actually set up what is now called the Malta Astronomical Society. It's still going strong, I'm proud to say, providing education, training, observation opportunities for amateurs, but also contributing on a more serious scientific footing to the discovery of variable stars, for example, solar, sunspot cycles, and that kind of stuff. So, we're doing our little bit to advance science. The reason why I was so much interested in this topic, I think, is because it answered one of my deeply felt needs in life: to be relevant, to, use my leadership skills, my communication skills, my educational orientation. I am at heart an educator, in such a way that also connects me with nature, connecting me with some of the smallest particles in nature. Because for those who may not know, when we talk about shooting stars, these are not stars. In spite of the name, this is just debris, usually micro particles in space. And when they hit the upper atmosphere, they just disintegrate. And all we see is their death, the way in which they disappear. So it's the study of these very small items, which nevertheless allows us to have some fantastic insights into the workings of the solar system and perhaps of the universe. And I think this is the running thread throughout my career. focusing on the small, focusing on the infinitesimal, sometimes the invisible, things that many people discard as irrelevant and insignificant. But yet, from that smallness, from those insights that come from smallness, so many interesting truths pan out. And this particular hypothesis or working hypothesis has been fleshed out, I think, for the latest 2 decades, 3 decades of my life in relation to two main areas, which have a strong overlap. One is the study of islands, and the other is the study of small states, many of which, of course, like Malta, are also islands.
So that's a lot to digest, Professor, and it's fascinating. I mean, one could go into multiple directions from that wonderful introduction that you gave. But I am tempted to go into the branch of island studies and particularly small islands to begin with. Now, I personally actually am a newcomer, a relative amateur. I should add, although people in island studies, including yourself, Professor Godfrey Baldacchino, have been very kind, very generous, and I feel encouraged. But at the same time, from my amateur lenses, when I saw if a small state and a small European island state, which is Faroe Islands last year, I actually started, visualizing many of the theoretical parameters that you have been laying down for nearly 20 years or more that I can remember, because I think your first island studies papers that I have read date back to 2003 or maybe slightly earlier. So I've been seeing you as an activist, for lack of a better word, for not merely for political change in Ireland, but for a new kind of an epistemology around how people view small islands and small states. Now, one is generally mistaken to think that small means beautiful, vulnerable, and eventually weak. So that weakness does not seem to be very evident in your writing. On the contrary, your writing gives a lot of hope would be an overstatement or maybe a cliche, but your writing gives a completely new perspective as to how islands can navigate, how islands can totally re-visualize, particularly the small ones, their position, in the surrounding oceans and under planetary conditions. So I don't know if I'm making sense to you. Is this
You are
something
making
that
a lot of sense.
is this something that you've been consciously trying to do, Professor?
You are making a lot of sense, and looking back, in a way, it makes more sense because while you're in the journey may sound and look chaotic and not necessarily leading in a linear or straight line. There are many alleys and cul-de-sacs on the way, but looking back, it seems that yes, I have been an activist. I would even say a political activist, because of course, being in Malta as well, it's impossible not to be involved directly or indirectly in policymaking. The cabinet of ministers in Malta are all graduates of our university. It's a small country. We have just one public university. So yeah, some influence has fallen over, spilled over into people who matter, who take decisions. But on the international camp, I think, yes, you are correct. I've spent a lot of time trying to argue with my feet firmly on the ground, always, that islands get a very bad press. Islands, almost by association. When you mentioned the word insularity, it's a word I don't like at all. I would prefer the word islandness, because islandness is more neutral, and it at least suggests that there may not only be vulnerabilities in relation to islands, there may also be opportunities. And this is the way in which island life unfolds. There are, of course, problems and challenges, but which country in the world doesn't have challenges? And in the case of small islands, of course, the challenges come from the sea, by and large. Challenges come from limited size, sometimes a high population density. But once again, islanders have risen to the challenge, and very often they have managed to set up diasporas overseas. They have invested in sending people away. There's a culture of migration very often, and repeat migration and circular migration. So there is this circularity that renders the study of islands more complex than people think. In other words, when I study islands, I don't just look at a piece of land surrounded by water in isolation. That would be a grave mistake. Every island, once an island is discovered, it is connected. And it is the level and the depth of that connectivity that allows you to identify the richness of island life. That's why island life is possible in the first place. Through migration, through circularity, through a tortuous relationship, yes, agreed, but a relationship nevertheless with mainlands and other islands.
So, Professor, when I was writing my book, Adam's Bridge, perhaps you might recall, and I suppose you will because it also is reflected in the review that you wrote about Adam's Bridge, that you suggested to me to look at a particular island scape. It's not exactly an island; it's more like a barren island between India and Sri Lanka. I'm not naming it today, but eventually, who knows? We might want to discuss it someday in the future. But you told me to study that in relation with certain Japanese islands, certain other islands in Southeast Asia and South America, particularly Chile and Argentina. Now that was a fabulous way to think about islands, but this brings us to the very eerie, let's say, analogy from quantum mechanics. And I use the word analogy or metaphor. We are not talking about science here, but simply borrowing a metaphor, that of entanglement. Is there, so what you were talking about, the connectivity that islands start enjoying, or it's almost as if islands are condemned to be connected. So does entanglement play a very serious role? When islands studies scholars use this word about island entanglement, what do you think they actually mean, and do you support the use of this kind of a notion?
Yes, certainly. And it's not just the geography and the economics and the maritime routes that speak to this entanglement. It's also the way in which the history of these places unfolds. It's also the way in which the very psyche of the islanders, where they exist, unfolds. Remember, we're not just talking necessarily about unpopulated islands. There are 85,000 populated islands in the world. The people who live on these islands have this grasp of the world in such a way that, of course, they are the center of the universe. They can't help it. But at the same time, they know that it's a question of relations, connections, cycles, ebbs and flows, to use a maritime metaphor. And this becomes even more interesting to examine when we look at the world's shared islands. And that's why I asked you to consider, first of all, keeping in mind that most islands are run as single jurisdictions. It seems that the world doesn't tolerate shared islands very nicely. And where there are shared islands, there are only 10 populated islands around the world that are shared between more than one country. And the situation is not necessarily one of harmony and peace and people living together in everlasting friendship. There are tensions and issues in places like Cyprus, in Ireland, in East Timor, and other parts of the world. So we have a situation where the geography suggests isolation, all-inclusiveness, comprehensiveness. That's what you see when you see a piece of land surrounded by water. That's how people draw islands. I give an assignment to my students, usually in my first class. I tell them, draw an island, not a particular island. Draw something that, in your opinion, crystallizes the essential ingredients of an island. And typically, they use the frame for water. They'll put an island somewhere in the middle, and it will have a circular-ish shape, sometimes with a port, if they think hard enough, right? So all that suggests a certain intimacy. But of course, this only belies part of the truth. Each of those islands, while separated and clearly delineated by the land-sea interface, must also have a connection. Without that connection, that island does not even exist. It doesn't even exist. So once discovered, the island is connected, at least in our minds, and then subsequently in maritime routes.
That's a very 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 new perspective. So I am sort of beginning to be privy to these perspectives for a few years now, maybe 3 or 4, a little over than that. But generally speaking, I don't think the world views islands as that. And is there a kind of a, let's say, I know the word colonial is overused and people draw multiple kinds of meanings from that word, but particularly coming from Malta, Professor, but you have also, you're a very well traveled person, even in those hobby years of astronomy, as it were. You studied at Warwick and the Hague. So Malta is small, but it is quite autonomous, and it is very conscious of its smallness, and it knows how to navigate. But do islands generally enjoy that privilege, or are islands colonized by people's ways of seeing?
It's a very good question, and this is very much at the heart of the post-colonial dilemma. When a country is independent, however, in spite of it being small, in a way it forces itself to be more self-assertive, to look at the world also from its own vantage point. It becomes an inevitable baggage of sovereignty. And I think that's one of the privileges of Malta. So in spite of its minuteness, we are the 10th smallest country in the world by land area. Because we are a sovereign state and have been since 1964, we look at the world perhaps with more assertiveness, with more confidence than possibly our large island to the north, Sicily. Sicily is the largest island in the Mediterranean. It has a population of over 5 million people. It could be a state. It's only 3 kilometers away from mainland Italy. And yet it is not a country, right? That makes a difference. So we have this privilege, I think, of being a jurisdiction, a sovereign state, having our own university, which of course helps immensely. The University of Malta is the oldest and the largest public university in the Commonwealth outside the UK. So there's a long history of people thinking, reflecting about their predicament. So what I did basically, I was the right man at the right time, I think. So I served on the surface of this wave with a fantastic surfboard, and try to take the conversation in different directions. One of them, for sure, being the whole idea of resilience, the whole idea of opportunities arising from island status. It's a very welcome shift from simply calling islands vulnerable spaces and therefore caught in this structural vice from which they cannot escape. I think that kind of discourse now is history. Islands don't usually refer to themselves in that way. There is always agency. There's always something you can do.
And finally, coming to your own work, the very thrust of your work, because there have been some intellectual intellectually animated debates. I don't want to use the word controversy, but there have been animated debates in the field of island studies, and I think there should be, as any good discipline. And you yourself were so, I think, so robust in your, let's say, oversight of island studies, which is a body of work, a very diverse quantity of work with diverse views. So what are archipelagos other than a geographical idea? Simply outside the field of geography, which calls archipelagos land clusters on the water, right? Outside this very reductive idea, Professor, what are archipelagos according to you, and what kind of stand do you take vis-a-vis archipelagos?
All right, let me try to dissect that question into parts. First of all, of course, a discipline like island studies, which I have been privileged to advance in such noticeable ways, noticeable enough for you to notice, is going to take you in different directions, obviously. You may start off from a ramp, a core, an investigation of core principles, basic epistemology, and then, of course, different people will run with that in different directions. That's what disciplines usually do. And of course, as that happens, you are also likely to enter into debates, controversies, perhaps. For example, the role of an open economy in a small island, is that a plus or a minus? I've had a long-running debate with a colleague from Malta, economist Lino Briguglio, for example, whom I respect immensely. But what has also happened is that people start espying niches or gaps in the literature and going down those gaps. So one of them certainly is the archipelago line. I think it's a very, very important area, starting from the simple position that when we talk about islands, we usually say islands with an S, islands in the plural. So obviously there are more than one island in consideration. And so I think it begets the question, if there's more than one island in the mix, then don't they also have a relationship between them? Isn't there also an island dynamic? And the answer is usually yes. So then you explore that and you start realizing, for example, that within a cluster of islands, there is usually one that stands out to the chagrin and jealousy of all the others. That one becomes like the mainland. So you can have multiple levels of insularity within the same archipelago. A dominant island, perhaps a second best island, trying very hard to topple the first and take over, with multiple centers of power, and the dynamics of tourism, the dynamics of policymaking often reflect this tussle for power within archipelagos. So I think it's fascinating. I've taken this idea forward, particularly in relation to tourism. I've studied island tourism for many years. My PhD thesis many years ago was also about labor management dynamics in hospitality industries in two island states, Malta and Barbados. So it's a fascinating theme. And it reminds us that we really need to take on board what's happening within the island cluster, because otherwise we will be committing the same mistake that people do to us when they render us invisible. We cannot commit the same mistake ourselves by rendering our smaller islands invisible.
Well, thank you so much, ever so much, Professor Baldacchino. I know that you have many very interesting and hotly debated, if I might add, ideas up your sleeve, because Godfrey Baldacchino has published hundreds of articles, and I might be understating in my stress on the word hundreds. So he has very passionately, to my knowledge, also argued for the joint or shared administrations of islands. Professor, you can please correct me if I'm wrong. And I would urge the audience to please go and look up Professor Baldacchino's work, and please connect with him. Professor Baldacchino, I would very much hope that you enjoyed having this conversation, and you might want to return someday in the future. So thank you so much, Professor, for joining my podcast, and I wish
if you
you a
can
very
allow me 1 minute, particularly
sure.
for those of your listeners who
Sure.
may not be interested in islands. You don't have to be interested in islands to appreciate what islands can give you and can deliver. Because some of the world's most intractable problems, including contested spaces, for instance, contested territories, contested boundaries. There are lots of these examples around the world. If you're looking for ways and means of creatively solving solutions like this, look at islands. You'd be surprised from the huge universe of islands out there. There are so many examples of fairly successful best practices that have led to solutions between tense neighbors.
Exactly the point I was trying to make. So joint or shared administration does not merely mean about islands, but if somebody is looking for territorial resolutions, then one can always turn to islands, surely academically, surely in a scholarly capacity, to look for very creative solutions. And this is something that Professor Baldacchino has lent to me a piece of wisdom a couple of years ago. Thank you so much, Professor, once again, and it was a great privilege to have you on board. And I very much hope, Professor, that you return someday not far from today. And thank you, dear audience, for watching our podcast. Until next time, see ya.